They left me 300 miles from home with a note that said build some character, and honestly, looking back now, that was the best thing anyone ever did for me, even if they meant it as the cruelest joke of their lives. I'm Simon, 35, and I spent the last decade working as a mechanic under a boss named Larry who treated me like I was invisible unless something went wrong. Married to a woman named Anna who slowly convinced me I wasn't interesting enough for her friends, wasn't social enough for her parties, wasn't fun enough for her life. My wife and her crew, especially her best friend Maddie, they had this way of making me feel like I was always one awkward comment away from ruining everything, like I was some pet project they kept trying to fix but secretly wished they could return. Every Friday night, they'd have their wine sessions at our apartment, and I'd hear them laughing in the living room while I'd be in the garage fixing someone's brake job for extra cash. And sometimes the laughter would stop right when I walked in, like I'd interrupted something important. Anna would smile at me, that tight smile that said, "Please don't embarrass me." And I'd grab a beer and disappear back into my space because that's what worked. That's what kept the peace. The whole thing started with their annual girls' trip, this retreat they did every year up in the mountains. And this time Anna insisted I come along because apparently Maddie's boyfriend was coming and it would be weird if I didn't. At least that's what she told me, though I'd never even heard her mention Maddie having a boyfriend before. I didn't want to go, told her that multiple times, but she did this thing where she'd sigh and say I never wanted to do anything with her anymore, that I was becoming distant, and I'd feel guilty enough to agree. So I packed a bag, got in Maddie's SUV with all of them, and drove 6 hours into nowhere while they talked about people I didn't know and laughed at inside jokes I wasn't part of, and every time I tried to join the conversation someone would change the subject. The whole ride I kept noticing these looks between Anna and Maddie, these little smirks when they thought I wasn't paying attention, and when I asked if everything was okay, Anna just patted my leg and said everything was perfect in that voice she used when she was lying. We pulled up to this cabin in the middle of absolute nowhere. I mean 300 miles from civilization, no cell service except for random spots where you might catch one bar if you were lucky, just trees and silence, and this overwhelming feeling that something was very wrong. There were way too many supplies for a weekend trip, enough food for 2 weeks, bottled water stacked in the corner, extra blankets, and when I mentioned it seemed excessive, Maddie just laughed and said they liked to be prepared. That night, everyone was weirdly nice to me, like suspiciously nice. Anna kept touching my arm and asking if I was having fun, and I noticed Maddie's boyfriend never actually showed up, which should have been my first clue. I woke up the next morning to complete silence, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something was wrong, because that cabin was never quiet. Those women were loud about everything. I got out of bed and the whole place was empty. Not a single person, not a single bag except mine, and on the kitchen table was a note written in Maddie's handwriting that said, "Build some character, Simon. We'll see you when you figure it out," with a little smiley face that made my stomach drop. I ran outside just in time to see the SUV disappearing down the dirt road, and I could see them through the back window, all of them laughing, and Maddie was holding up her phone recording the whole thing like it was the funniest prank in the world. I stood there in my boxers and a t-shirt watching the dust settle, 300 miles from home, no car, barely any cell service, and this note telling me to build character like I was some project they'd finally decided to abandon in the woods. The first hour I was furious, I mean shaking angry, pacing around that cabin trying to figure out what kind of person does this to someone. What kind of wife agrees to this? What kind of friends think abandoning someone in the mountains is funny? I tried calling Anna, but the service was so bad it wouldn't even connect. Just that endless ringing that goes nowhere. And when I finally got through to voicemail, I didn't even leave a message because anything I said would just give them exactly what they wanted. The second hour, I felt this crushing weight of humiliation, imagining them in that SUV laughing about how I probably freaked out, probably cried, probably learned my lesson, and I could picture them rewatching that video Maddie took and showing it to people back home. But then the third hour something shifted, and I realized I was sitting on the porch of this cabin in complete silence. No boss yelling at me, no wife sighing at me for saying the wrong thing, no friends of hers making me feel like I was the boring person in the room, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I walked around the property and found it was actually pretty well stocked. Previous owners must have used it for hunting or something. There was a shed with tools, a generator that still worked, enough canned food to last weeks, and in the back corner of the property, there was this old barn that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I spent that whole day just existing without permission, if that makes sense, like I didn't have to apologize for taking up space or explain why I wasn't smiling enough. I fixed the porch railing that was loose, cleared some brush, got the generator running properly. And by the time the sun was setting, I was sitting there with a beer I found in the cabin fridge watching the sky turn orange over the mountains. And I realized this was the first time in 10 years I'd watched a sunset without checking my phone or worrying about what I was supposed to be doing. My phone buzzed around 6 that evening with a message from Anna asking if I'd learned something yet, with a bunch of laughing emojis, and I stared at it for a long time before deciding to leave it on, but stop responding. Let the messages pile up, so I could see exactly who she was when she thought I wasn't fighting back. That night, I made a decision, not a dramatic one, just a quiet choice while I was sitting in the dark of that cabin listening to absolutely nothing. I decided that if they wanted me to build character, I'd build it, but I'd build the version of me I actually wanted to be, not the version they'd been trying to sculpt for years. I didn't know what that meant yet, didn't have a plan. I just knew that for the first time since I could remember, I wasn't going to spend my energy trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. The next morning I woke up with this weird clarity, like my brain had been running on fumes for years, and someone finally let me sleep properly. And I decided to actually explore the property instead of sitting around feeling sorry for myself. The cabin itself was basic but solid, one bedroom, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, a living room with a wood stove that actually worked pretty well once I cleaned it out, and that shed I mentioned that turned out to be way more useful than I expected. Inside the shed, I found a whole workshop setup. Someone who owned this place before clearly knew their way around tools. There were wrenches, sockets, a vise that was rusted but functional, even an old arc welder that looked like it might still work, and I felt this excitement I hadn't felt about work in years. I spent most of that second day just organizing the space, cleaning tools, taking inventory of what I had to work with, and it felt good in a way that my job back home never did because this was mine. Nobody was standing over my shoulder telling me I was doing it wrong. Around noon on the third day, I heard an engine coming up the dirt road, and my first instinct was panic, thinking maybe Anna and her crew came back. But it was an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days about 30 years ago. This guy got out, probably in his 70s, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt, and he just stood there looking at the smoke coming from my chimney like he was trying to figure out if he should be concerned. He introduced himself as Earl, said he lived about 5 miles down the mountain and noticed someone was using the cabin, asked if I was the new owner because the last people who had it moved away about 3 years back. I told him the short version, that my wife and her friends thought it would be funny to leave me here as some kind of character building exercise, and I expected him to laugh or tell me that was ridiculous, but he just nodded slowly and said it sounded like they did me a favor whether they meant to or not. We talked for about an hour. He told me about the area, where the nearest town was, about 20 miles down a winding mountain road, said if I needed anything to let him know because people up here look out for each other. Before he left, he gave me a bag of supplies, some batteries, matches, a few cans of soup, said he'd check in on me in a few days, and that simple act of kindness from a complete stranger hit me harder than it should have, because I couldn't remember the last time someone just helped me without expecting something back. On day 5, I decided to explore that old barn in the back of the property, the one that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and when I finally got the rusted lock off and pulled those heavy doors open, I found something that made my heart actually skip. Sitting under a tarp covered in dust and bird droppings was a 1968 Ford Mustang. And I mean a real one, fastback, originally red but faded to this sad orange pink from years of sitting, flat tires, engine probably seized, but it was there like some kind of sign from the universe. I pulled the tarp off completely and just stood there staring at it. This beautiful machine that someone had loved enough to store carefully and then abandoned, and I felt this weird connection to it like we were both things that got left behind and forgotten. I spent the entire next week working on that car, and I'm talking sunrise to sunset, pulling the engine apart piece by piece, cleaning decades of grime out of the carburetor, replacing every fluid, checking every wire, and the whole time I was working, I felt this purpose I hadn't felt in years. Back home, I fixed cars because it was my job, and Larry made sure I knew I was replaceable. But here I was fixing this Mustang because I wanted to, because it mattered to me, because bringing something back to life felt like bringing myself back to life. Earl came back around day 9 with more supplies. And when he saw me working on the Mustang, he got this huge grin on his face, told me that car belonged to the previous owner's son who died in a motorcycle accident about 20 years ago, and the family could never bring themselves to sell it or move it. He said if I could get it running, I should keep it, that it deserved to be driven again instead of rotting in that barn. And I felt this responsibility suddenly, like I wasn't just fixing a car anymore. I was honoring someone's memory. By day 12, I had the engine freed up, new spark plugs in, fuel system cleaned, and when I turned the key for the first time and heard it cough and sputter and then roar to life, I actually laughed out loud, like genuinely laughed in a way I hadn't since I was a kid. The sound of that engine echoing off the mountains was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, and I sat in the driver's seat with my hands shaking on the steering while thinking about how 2 weeks ago I was standing in my garage back home feeling like I was suffocating, and now I was 300 miles away with grease under my fingernails and this insane smile on my face. I drove into town the next day, this little place called Iron Ridge that looked frozen in time, one main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a bar that probably served the same 6 people every night. I went into the diner just to get a real meal, and the waitress, this woman probably in her 50s, saw me walk in and immediately knew I wasn't local, but didn't make it weird, just asked if I was passing through or staying. I told her I was figuring that out, and she nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer and brought me the best burger I'd had in years. While I was eating, this guy came over, probably mid-40s, introduced himself as Dale, said he owned the repair shop on the edge of town, and noticed me driving that Mustang. Asked if I was the one who got it running because he'd heard about that car sitting in the barn for years. We got talking about engines and transmissions, and before I knew it he was offering me work, said he could use an extra set of hands a few days a week if I was interested, nothing formal, just cash under the table and whatever hours I wanted. I said yes without even thinking about it, because for the first time in my adult life someone was offering me work because they respected what I could do, not because they needed a body to fill a shift. I checked my phone that night for the first time in almost 2 weeks and found exactly what I expected, 47 messages from Anna that told the whole story of her slowly losing control of the narrative. The first few were joking, asking if I'd figured out my lesson yet. Then they got annoyed asking when I was coming back, then angry saying I was embarrassing her because people were asking questions, then desperate saying we needed to talk, and finally just mean, calling me selfish and childish, and saying if this was how I wanted to be then maybe we shouldn't be together anymore. I read through all of them without feeling much of anything, like I was reading about someone else's life, and when I got to her last message threatening that if I stayed there I shouldn't bother coming home, I actually felt relieved. I typed back one word, just okay, and something about that simple response felt more powerful than any argument I could have made. Sitting there in that cabin with the wood stove crackling and the smell of pine coming through the window, I realized I hadn't just stayed in the mountains because I was being stubborn. I stayed because for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't trying to be someone I wasn't. I was just being Simon, the guy who liked working with his hands and sitting in silence and not having to perform happiness for people who never really cared if I was actually happy or not. 3 months went by faster than I expected, and in that time, I'd become a completely different person. Or maybe I just became the person I was supposed to be before I spent a decade trying to shrink myself to fit into Anna's world. Dale and I started working together officially. He had more business than he could handle alone, and word spread fast in these small mountain towns that there was a new mechanic who actually knew what he was doing. So we ended up renting a bigger space and calling it Iron Ridge Auto. I bought the cabin from the family who owned it. Earl helped me negotiate a fair price and even co-signed some paperwork since I was still technically new to the area, and I spent my evenings fixing it up, replacing rotted boards, updating the plumbing, making it actually feel like home instead of just a place I was hiding. The Mustang became my daily driver and people in town started recognizing me by it. I'd pull up to the diner and the waitress would already have my coffee ready. I'd go to the hardware store and the owner would ask about whatever project I was working on, and it hit me one day that I had more real friends in 3 months here than I'd had in 10 years back home. My phone stayed mostly off except for when I needed it for work. And the few times I turned it on, there'd be messages from Anna that went from angry to confused to this weird mixture of both. Like she couldn't figure out if she should be mad at me for leaving or worried that I wasn't coming back begging for forgiveness. Around month 4, I got a message from her that was different from the others, less angry and more calculated, saying she wanted to talk in person, that we needed to figure things out like adults, and she'd drive up to see me if I'd just tell her where I was. I ignored it for a week, but she kept pushing, saying people were asking questions and she needed closure, and finally I sent her the address because part of me wanted her to see what I'd built, wanted her to understand that her little prank didn't break me. It freed me. She showed up on a Saturday morning with Maddie and 2 of her other friends, the same ones who'd been in that SUV laughing while they drove away 4 months earlier, and when they pulled up in front of my cabin, I was outside working on a customer's truck with Dale. The look on Anna's face when she got out was priceless. This mixture of shock and confusion, like she'd expected to find me broken down and desperate, not thriving and covered in engine grease with a legitimate business and a life that clearly didn't need her in it. Maddie recovered first with that fake concerned voice, saying they'd been so worried about me and couldn't believe I'd just disappeared like that without telling anyone where I was going. And I had to bite back a laugh because the audacity of that statement after what they did was almost impressive. Anna walked up to me, and I could see her trying to figure out what angle to take, whether to be angry or hurt or confused, and she landed on hurt, asking why I hadn't come home, why I'd ignored her messages, why I was doing this to her like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I wiped my hands on a rag and just looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and realized I didn't feel anything, not anger, not hurt, not even satisfaction that she was uncomfortable. I just felt neutral, like I was looking at a stranger I used to know. I told her I didn't come home because I was already home, that this was where I belonged, and she actually laughed like I'd made a joke, said I couldn't be serious about staying in the middle of nowhere working on cars when I had a whole life back in the city. I asked her what life exactly, the one where I worked for a boss who treated me like garbage so I could afford an apartment where I felt like a guest, where her friends made me feel like I was always one comment away from being the embarrassment of the evening, where she spent more time being annoyed with me than actually being with me. And she didn't have an answer for that, just stood there with her mouth open like she couldn't believe I was saying these things out loud. Maddie jumped in trying to salvage the situation, saying they'd made a mistake with the whole cabin thing, that it was supposed to be funny, but they realized it went too far, and I could tell she was doing damage control because other people had probably called them out for it. I looked at Maddie and told her the only mistake was that they thought I'd come crawling back proving I needed them, but instead I proved I never did, and her face went red because she wasn't used to me standing up to her, wasn't used to me being someone who didn't care about her opinion. Anna tried a different approach then, got softer, said she missed me and we could work through this, maybe do counseling. Maybe I could come back and we could start fresh, and I realized she wasn't here because she actually wanted me back. She was here because having a husband who left her and built a better life without her made her look bad to her friends. I told her I appreciated her coming all this way, but there was nothing to work through, that she'd told me not to come home if I stayed here, and I was taking her advice, and the way her face changed from fake sweetness to actual anger was almost worth the entire 6-hour drive she'd made. They left about 20 minutes later after Maddie tried a few more manipulation tactics that didn't land, and I watched their SUV disappear down the same dirt road they'd driven away on 4 months earlier. Except this time, I wasn't the one being abandoned. I was the one choosing to stay. Dale came over after they left, didn't ask questions, just handed me a beer and asked if I was good, and I nodded because I was better than good. I was free. That weekend I threw a barbecue at the cabin, invited Earl and his wife, Dale and his family, some of the regulars from the diner, and we all sat around a fire pit I'd built talking and laughing. And I looked around at these people who'd accepted me without needing me to be anything other than myself, and felt more at home than I ever had in that apartment back in the city. My phone buzzed once that night. A message from Anna that just said, "I hope you're happy." And I could tell from the way she phrased it that she meant it sarcastically, like happiness was something I didn't deserve or couldn't actually achieve without her. I looked at that message for a second, then typed back 2 words that were more honest than anything I'd said to her in years, just "I am." And I meant it completely, because the woman who'd left me in the mountains as a joke had accidentally given me the exact push I needed to find the life I was supposed to be living, and the character I built wasn't the one she wanted. It was the one I'd been too afraid to be until she forced me to choose between her version of me and the real one. And standing there with a beer in my hand surrounded by people who actually cared, I knew I'd made the right choice. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.